Welcome to WorldWise Studio, where the world's biggest ideas become surprisingly simple.
Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into the incredible paradox of Norway. We're going to map out exactly how a single country built unimaginable wealth by doing something completely beautifully counterintuitive. They struck it rich and then deliberately refused to spend their own money. Let's dive in. Today, Norway's sovereign wealth fund isn't just big. It is, quite literally, the largest pile of money on Earth. We're talking about roughly $1.5 trillion. To put that staggering number into perspective, this single fund is so absolutely enormous that it owns about 1.5% of every listed company globally. Think about that for a second. Statistically speaking, every time you buy a snack, use a search engine, or upgrade your phone, a microscopic fraction of that profit flows directly to a Norwegian nurse's future pension. And this brings us to the core mystery we're unraveling today. How does a nation become one of the wealthiest on the planet by treating its massive windfall as completely untouchable? Human instinct absolutely screams at us to spend a windfall, right? But Norway did the exact opposite. And the mechanics behind how they actually pulled this off are absolutely fascinating. The story actually begins with what just might be the luckiest geographical error in history. Back in the early 1960s, Norway and its neighbors quietly drew up their underwater maritime borders in the North Sea. By 1965, a famous geological survey essentially came out and said, look, don't bother, there's no oil here. But then, just 2 days before Christmas in 1969, a drilling crew had to check their instruments 3 separate times because they literally couldn't believe it. They had just discovered the massive Ekofisk oil field, right inside Norway's newly drawn borders. An absolute ocean of black gold had just landed right in their laps. Now you might be thinking, wow, striking oil, that's the ultimate golden ticket. But historically, it's usually an economic disaster. It triggers what economists call the resource curse, sometimes known as Dutch disease. It's this economic phenomenon where a sudden, massive influx of foreign cash acts like a really dangerous drug. It artificially inflates a country's currency, which makes their normal exports way too expensive for the rest of the world to buy. This basically suffocates all their other industries, turning resource-rich nations into one-trick ponies. When the oil finally runs out, or if the price crashes, the entire economy just collapses. So, to avoid this incredibly dangerous trap, Norway devised a brilliant cure. Instead of letting all that oil money flood in and inflate their currency like a giant balloon, they made the conscious choice to completely quarantine the wealth offshore. By intentionally keeping the money out of their local system, their normal, everyday domestic industries like seafood, shipping, and hydropower could actually survive, thrive, and stay globally competitive. But, to pull off that level of strict quarantine, they needed extreme discipline. Before the really big money even started flowing, Norwegian officials did something that is almost eerie in its foresight. In 1971, they actually sat down and wrote the 10 Oil Commandments. They mapped out the strict rules of the game to tightly control the impending boom before any real fortunes were actually at stake. And these rules, they were radical. First off, they boldly declared that the oil belongs to the people forever, not to whichever foreign company happens to drill it. Second, foreign companies were totally welcome to come and drill, but they were legally required to teach their engineering secrets to Norwegians. And third, a state company, originally called Statoil, which is now Equinor, was created specifically to learn the business from the inside out. They didn't just want the cash, they wanted the actual knowledge. That intense early discipline laid the foundation for everything that came next. Fast forward to 1990. After a brief scare with an oil price crash perfectly proved just how dangerous spending oil money at home could be, they built the ultimate quarantine. They created the Government Petroleum Fund, which was designed specifically to act as this giant offshore vault to protect the domestic economy from runaway inflation. The mechanics of this fund were brutally simple but unbelievably strict. Step 1, funnel essentially all oil revenues directly into this giant piggy bank. Step 2, legally forbid the fund from investing a single cent inside Norway. All of that money had to be invested abroad. It brilliantly converted a dangerous domestic drug into a quiet, steady global harvest. But look, a giant pile of money really only has one natural predator: politicians looking to spend it. So, in 2001, they introduced their absolute masterstroke, the fiscal action rule. They put a tiny little tap on this massive fund, restricted to roughly 3%. This means the government is only allowed to spend the expected real return, basically the interest, and never, ever the principal. The golden goose itself is legally untouchable. The country only gets to keep the eggs. And because that principle has just sat there, compounding, uninterrupted for decades, the results are mind-boggling. Today, the fund equals roughly $250,000 for every single man, woman, and child in Norway. It acts as a permanent financial engine, just constantly growing in the background. Now, managing this staggering level of wealth is a completely different challenge. They don't just dump it anywhere. The fund quietly buys up small slices of roughly 9,000 companies across 70 different countries. On top of that, it operates with radical public transparency. Literally anyone can go online and look up its exact holdings. It's also guided by a strict ethics council that publicly blacklists businesses tied to weapons, tobacco, or severe human rights abuses. Because of its sheer size, when Norway decides to divest, global boardrooms literally flinch. But here's the real secret. Rules on paper mean absolutely nothing if politicians just decide to raid the vault during an election year to promise voters flashy new programs. Plenty of other countries have set up funds with strict rules, and they still totally failed. This is where Norway's cultural trust engine saved the country. It is the invisible gear making this entire massive machine actually work. See, before the oil boom, Norway was actually kind of the poor cousin of Scandinavia. Decades of shared hardship built a deeply, stubbornly egalitarian society. Flaunting wealth in Norway was, and honestly still is, considered mildly shameful. If you were to build a giant gold statue on your roof, your neighbors wouldn't admire you. They'd just think you're obnoxious. This culture totally removes the political incentive to splurge. You literally cannot buy votes in Norway by promising to raid the national piggy bank for luxury. So this trust engine basically relies on three main pillars. First, there was consensus across party lines before the fortunes were even at stake, meaning everyone co-owns the promise. Second, you have a culture that actively punishes greedy politicians at the ballot box. And third, absolute transparency. Every single krone is publicly visible. That makes it politically impossible to quietly loot the nation's future in the dark. It all has to be debated in broad daylight. Now, despite this monumental success, this explainer wouldn't be complete without looking at the cracks in the foundation. Geology gave them a winning lottery ticket, and discipline built the machine. But we have to ask the hard question, is this wealth machine truly unbreakable? Well, nothing is perfect, and Norway currently faces three very awkward tensions that absolutely threaten this system. Let's break these risks down. First up, the green paradox. Norway drives more electric cars per person than anywhere else on Earth, yet they fund this incredibly green lifestyle by selling oil and gas to the rest of the world. Second, the size risk. The fund is now so massive that it wildly dwarfs Norway's actual GDP. A bad decade in the global stock markets hits their national budget so much harder than a crash in oil prices ever did. And third, constant temptation. Every single crisis or election cycle aggressively tests that strict 3% rule. Each new generation has to actively re-choose the discipline of their grandparents. But ultimately, Norway has achieved something completely unprecedented in economic history. They took a temporary, dangerous, polluting resource that they would eventually run out of, and through sheer, unrelenting discipline, they transformed it into a permanent, world-spanning financial engine. They converted a fleeting oil boom into permanent global ownership. And the takeaway here, it actually scales right down from a sovereign nation to your own personal life. It's profound. If you ever receive a massive windfall, maybe an inheritance, a lucky year in business, a huge bonus, treat it as a seed to plant, not as income to spend. Live only off the harvest, that small percentage it yields, and fiercely, fiercely protect the principle. So I'm going to leave you with this final thought. It is really easy to look at a nation's discipline and applaud it from afar, but what about human nature on a personal level? If you suddenly struck it rich tomorrow, finding your very own personal oil field, would you actually have the discipline to quarantine your wealth, live off just 3%, and let it compound for your future?